Michael Torres had always been a creature of habit. His life in Wilmington, Delaware, followed patterns so predictable that neighbors could set their watches by his movements. Every weekday at 6:45, he backed his sedan out of the driveway. Every Saturday morning, he jogged the same 3-mile loop through Brandywine Park. Sundays meant grocery shopping at 9, followed by meal prep that carried them through the week. His wife, Elena, fit into that rhythm seamlessly. She worked as a marine biologist for a coastal research institute, a position that required frequent trips to various Atlantic monitoring stations. Her schedule was less predictable than his, shaped by tide patterns, weather conditions, and grant deadlines. But even her irregularity had become familiar. Michael had learned to read the signs when she was preparing for field work. The way she checked equipment twice, packed her waterproof cases methodically, and went over her research notes late into the evening. They had been married for 11 years when everything changed. Their relationship was not passionate in the cinematic sense, but it was solid. They shared mortgage payments, holiday traditions with both families, and quiet evenings where conversation felt optional rather than necessary. Michael worked in municipal urban planning, reviewing zoning applications and attending city council meetings that rarely produced drama. Elena's work was more dynamic, involving water quality assessments, marine ecosystem monitoring, and occasional collaborative projects with federal agencies. Their home was a modest 2-story colonial in a neighborhood where American flags hung from. Porches and children played street hockey during summer evenings. Inside, the rooms reflected their life together. Framed photos from their wedding in Cape May. A bookshelf split between his urban development texts and her oceanography journals. A kitchen table where they ate meals facing each other, discussing budgets, maintenance issues, and the recurring question of whether to finally renovate the basement. Elena had a calmness about her that Michael appreciated. She rarely raised her voice. When problems emerged, she approached them methodically, breaking them into manageable components. If the car needed repairs, she researched mechanics and compared prices. If relatives created tension during holidays, she deflected with humor and kept conversations moving. That measured temperament made her well-suited for her work, where patience and precision mattered more than speed. In the months before she disappeared, Michael noticed small shifts. Elena began working later hours at the institute, sometimes not returning until well past dinner. She explained it as grant season, a period when researchers competed for federal funding and worked extended schedules to strengthen their proposals. Michael accepted this without concern. Her career had always included seasonal intensity. She also seemed more distracted during their conversations. He would mention plans for the weekend, and she would nod without fully engaging, her mind clearly elsewhere. When he asked if everything was all right, she reassured him with a tired smile, blaming exhaustion from long days in the lab. He noticed she had started keeping her phone face down on the table, something she had never done before. When it buzzed with notifications, she would glance at it quickly and then flip it back over without explanation. Mail began arriving addressed only to her. Thick envelopes from financial institutions, legal firms, and agencies Michael did not recognize. When he asked about them, Elena said they were related to research administration, nothing that concerned him. He trusted her judgment. She had always managed her professional affairs independently, and he saw no reason to question that now. One Saturday morning, she announced she was scheduled for an offshore data collection trip. The institute had chartered a research vessel to gather samples from deeper Atlantic waters, and her team would be gone for the day. Michael asked basic questions. What time would she leave? When should he expect her back? She answered with the same calm efficiency she always displayed. Early departure, return by evening. Standard protocol. That morning she packed her gear with familiar precision. Waterproof duffel, laptop secured in a protective case, field notebooks, sample containers, and her personal flotation device. She wore her institute jacket, navy blue with the organization's emblem on the chest. Before leaving, she kissed him on the forehead and said she would call when they docked. Michael watched her pull out of the driveway in her car, the taillights disappearing around the corner as the sun climbed higher. He spent the day completing household tasks. He mowed the lawn, cleaned the gutters, and organized the garage. By late afternoon, he expected a call. When his phone remained silent, he assumed the research was running longer than planned. Ocean work was unpredictable. Conditions changed. Equipment malfunctioned. Delays were common. By early evening, concern began replacing patience. He called her cell. No answer. He tried again. Voicemail. He contacted the Research Institute, reaching an automated system that offered no live assistance on weekends. He left a message asking someone to return his call urgently. As darkness settled, his unease sharpened into alarm. He called the Coast Guard, explaining that his wife had been on a research vessel and had not returned. The officer on duty took his information and said they would investigate. Within an hour, 2 uniformed officers arrived at his door. Their expressions were controlled, but Michael could read the seriousness beneath their professionalism. The vessel Alina was supposed to be on had returned to port hours earlier. According to the captain, Alina Torres had never boarded. There was no record of her being part of that day's crew manifest. The Institute confirmed that while Alina had requested time off for personal reasons, she had not been assigned to any offshore project that weekend. Michael struggled to process the information. If she was not on the research vessel, where had she gone? The officers asked if she had seemed distressed recently, if there had been arguments, if he knew of any personal problems. He answered honestly. There had been no fights, no signs of crisis, nothing that suggested she was planning to leave. The next morning, a jogger discovered Elena's car in a beach parking lot near Cape Henlopen. The doors were locked. Her research gear sat in the trunk, untouched. On the front seat, officers found her wallet, her phone, and her wedding ring placed carefully on top of a folded note. The note was brief, written in her handwriting. "I'm sorry, I can't explain. Please don't look for me." Coast Guard teams searched the coastline. Helicopters monitored the waters. Divers checked submerged areas near where her car was found. No body was recovered. No clothing, no additional belongings, no evidence explaining what had happened. The case shifted from rescue to recovery, and eventually to something unresolved, a missing person investigation that remained open but inactive. Michael returned to an empty house that still smelled like her shampoo. He continued going to work, attending meetings, reviewing plans, but everything felt distant and hollow. Friends and family offered support, but their words could not fill the absence. He was left with a note that provided no answers and a wedding ring that sat on his nightstand. A small circle of metal that represented everything he thought he understood but clearly did not. The investigation into Elena's disappearance produced more questions than answers. Detectives assigned to the case interviewed Michael repeatedly, their questions circling the same territory. Had she mentioned leaving? Were there financial problems, affairs, substance abuse? Michael answered each question with the same bewildered honesty. There had been nothing. No warnings, no clues, nothing that prepared him for her absence. Forensic teams examined her car, but found no signs of struggle or foul play. Her laptop, retrieved from their home, showed routine work correspondence and research documents. Her bank accounts revealed regular transactions, paychecks deposited, and bills paid until the day she vanished. After that, silence. No withdrawals, no credit card activity, no digital footprint. Detectives explored possibilities. Had she staged her own death to escape something? Was she a victim of crime, despite the lack of evidence? The note suggested intentional departure, but her methods remained unclear. If she wanted to disappear, she had done so without leaving a trail anyone could follow. Michael attended a press conference where detectives appealed for public information. Photographs of Alina appeared on local news broadcasts. Tips came in, most leading nowhere. Someone claimed to have seen a woman matching her description at a bus station in Philadelphia. Another reported a similar-looking person at a Maryland rest stop. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Months passed. The investigation lost momentum. Detectives stopped calling weekly, then monthly. Eventually, contact ceased altogether unless Michael initiated it. The case remained technically open, filed among thousands of unresolved disappearances that lacked sufficient evidence to move forward. Michael's colleagues at the planning department tried to help by maintaining normalcy. They invited him to lunch, included him in after-work gatherings, and avoided mentioning Alina unless he brought her up first. But their careful kindness only emphasized what was missing. He attended meetings and reviewed proposals, but his focus had fractured. Decisions that once seemed important now felt trivial. His family urged him to consider grief counseling. He attended 3 sessions before stopping. Sitting in a therapist's office, dissecting emotions he could not name, felt counterproductive. The therapist asked what he was feeling. He did not know. Sadness, anger, confusion, all of it blended into a persistent numbness that made daily functioning possible but not meaningful. Elena's parents struggled differently. Her mother called frequently, asking if Michael had heard anything new. Her father, a retired electrician, drove to Wilmington several times to help with house repairs Michael had been neglecting. They never blamed him, but their grief created an uncomfortable intimacy. They were bound together by loss and the unanswered question of why their daughter had chosen to vanish. 2 years after Elena disappeared, Michael sold the house. Living in spaces they had shared felt like existing inside a museum dedicated to a life that no longer made sense. He moved into a smaller apartment closer to downtown Wilmington, a one-bedroom unit with minimal decoration. He kept only what was necessary, donating or discarding most of their shared belongings. He kept her wedding ring, though he was unsure why. Work became his anchor. He accepted additional projects, volunteered for committees, and stayed late reviewing documents that did not require extended hours. Colleagues praised his dedication. In truth, he simply had nowhere else to be. Evenings at home stretched long and silent. He filled them with podcasts, streaming shows he barely watched, and routine tasks that consumed time without demanding thought. He dated briefly. A woman from a neighboring department, introduced by a well-meaning coworker. They had dinner 3 times. She was kind, intelligent, and patient with his obvious emotional distance. On their 4th dinner, she gently suggested he was not ready. He agreed. She wished him well. He never contacted her again. By the 5th year, Michael had adjusted to a life defined by absence. He no longer expected resolution. He stopped checking news reports about unidentified remains or following up with detectives who had long since moved on to active cases. Elena's disappearance became a fact he carried, something that shaped him but no longer consumed him. He developed new routines. Morning runs extended to 5 miles. He joined a recreational soccer league that played weekends. He took a woodworking class and built a bookshelf that now stood in his living room, uneven but functional. These activities filled time and provided structure, which was enough. Friends stopped asking if he had heard anything. Conversations moved to other topics: promotions, vacations, children's milestones. Michael participated, offering appropriate responses and maintaining social connections that felt genuine enough. He was functional, stable, and capable of navigating daily life. What he was not, and perhaps would never be again, was whole. 9 years after Elena walked out of their home and vanished, Michael's supervisor assigned him to a regional urban development conference in Miami. The conference focused on sustainable coastal planning, a topic relevant to Wilmington's ongoing waterfront revitalization projects. Michael agreed to attend, viewing it as a professional obligation rather than an opportunity. He flew to Miami on a Thursday afternoon, checked into the conference hotel, and reviewed the schedule. Panels, workshops, networking receptions, standard fare. He planned to attend the required sessions, take notes, and return home without incident. He had no reason to expect that within 48 hours, everything he thought he understood about Elena's disappearance would collapse. The conference hotel connected directly to a shopping complex, a sprawling structure of glass and polished floors designed to keep attendees circulating between sessions and retail spaces. Michael found the layout disorienting. Escalators led to unexpected levels. Corridors branched in directions that defied simple navigation. After 2 days of presentations, he needed air and distance from conference crowds. Saturday afternoon, during a break between panels, he walked through the complex without a destination. Stores displayed luxury goods he had no interest in purchasing. Families moved past him, tourists clutching shopping bags and checking phones. The noise level was constant but not unpleasant. A low hum of voices and background music that required no attention. He stopped near a fountain on the 2nd level, considering whether to return to his room or find lunch. As he turned toward the directory, a woman crossed his peripheral vision about 30 feet away. Her posture caught his attention first. The way she held her shoulders slightly forward, as if perpetually leaning into conversation. It was a stance he had seen thousands of times. Michael's focus sharpened. The woman wore a light sundress and sandals, her hair shorter than he remembered but the same dark brown. A man walked beside her, tall and dressed casually. Between them, a young boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, held the man's hand while pointing excitedly at a store display. The woman laughed at something the child said, bending slightly to respond. The angle of her face, the movement, the specific tilt of her head triggered immediate recognition. Michael felt his chest constrict. His breathing changed rhythm. It was Elena. He began walking toward them, his pace quickening without conscious decision. The family moved along the corridor, unaware of his approach. Michael called out, "Alina!" His voice came out louder than intended, cutting through the ambient noise. The woman stopped. She turned, and for a brief, suspended moment, their eyes met. Her expression shifted through recognition, shock, and something close to panic. She did not speak. Instead, she gripped the man's arm and whispered something Michael could not hear. The man looked back, his face registering confusion. The boy tugged at his father's hand, asking a question. Elena turned away quickly, pulling her family toward a side exit. Michael followed, pushing past other shoppers. "Alina, wait!" He was running now, trying to close the distance. But the crowd thickened near a department store entrance. Bodies blocked his path. By the time he reached the corridor where they had turned, they were gone. He searched for 20 minutes, moving through levels and scanning every visible space. Nothing. They had vanished into the sprawl of Miami's urban density. Michael returned to the fountain, his hands shaking. He sat on a bench, trying to process what had happened. Had he imagined it? 9 years of unresolved grief could distort perception, but the recognition had been visceral, undeniable. He pulled out his phone and called the Wilmington Police Department, reaching a weekend dispatcher who took his information with professional detachment. She promised to pass the message to the detective division on Monday. Michael understood the subtext. Missing person cases 9 years old did not generate urgent responses, especially based on unconfirmed sightings hundreds of miles away. That night, he barely slept. He replayed the encounter repeatedly, examining every detail. The woman's reaction confirmed she knew him. She had not looked confused or mistaken. She had looked caught. The next morning, he skipped the final conference sessions and returned to the shopping complex. He approached the security office on the ground level, explaining that he believed he had seen a family member reported missing years earlier. The supervisor, a middle-aged woman with skeptical eyes, asked basic questions. When did this occur? What were they wearing? Where exactly did he see them? Michael provided descriptions. The supervisor made a call, spoke briefly, and then explained that while they could review footage internally, privacy regulations prevented them from sharing it with civilians. However, if he filed a formal request through law enforcement, they would cooperate with any official investigation. Michael asked if there were residential complexes nearby. The supervisor mentioned several condominium towers within walking distance, part of a mixed-use development that included retail, dining, and housing. She could not provide resident information, but suggested checking public property records if he had specific addresses. He spent the afternoon walking the surrounding blocks, photographing building names and entrance directories. Most were secured, requiring keycards or codes. But one building had an open lobby with a wall of mailboxes visible from the entrance. Michael entered, moving quickly toward the mailboxes. Most displayed only apartment numbers. A few showed names. He scanned the labels methodically, row by row. Near the bottom, one name stopped him. E.I. Reeves, Unit 412, the first initial. The possibility felt too specific to ignore. He photographed the label, noted the building address, and left. Back at his hotel, Michael searched Florida property records online. Residential databases were partially public, listing ownership information for tax purposes. He entered the building address and unit number. The record showed a lease agreement under the name Elena Reeves's tenant since 6 years prior. He requested additional documentation, including any identification photos associated with permit applications or property management files. One document included a scanned copy of a driver's license. When the image loaded, Michael stared at the screen. The face was Elena's. Older, yes, the hair different. But the eyes, the structure, the unmistakable features were hers. She was alive. She had been alive for 9 years. And she had built an entirely new existence. Michael flew back to Wilmington on Monday morning carrying printouts of property records, photographs of the mailbox, and the driver's license image. He went directly from the airport to the police department requesting to speak with someone from the detective division. After a 40-minute wait, he was directed to a small conference room where Detective Sarah Brennan introduced herself. Brennan was in her early 40s, her manner direct and efficient. She listened as Michael explained the Miami sighting, showed the photographs, and presented the property records. She studied each document carefully, making notes on a legal pad. When he finished, she asked whether he had approached Alina directly or contacted anyone at the Miami address. Michael said he had not. Brennan nodded, explaining that was the correct decision. If Elena Torres was indeed living under a different name, premature contact could prompt her to relocate again. The detective asked permission to retain copies of everything Michael had brought. He agreed immediately. Brennan made no promises. She explained that missing person cases involving adults who left voluntarily occupied a complicated legal space. If Elena had not committed fraud or other crimes, her choice to disappear might not constitute a prosecutable offense. However, the circumstances warranted further investigation. Brennan said she would coordinate with Miami authorities and contact Michael once they had more information. 2 weeks passed before Brennan called. She asked Michael to return to the station. When he arrived, she was accompanied by another detective, William Chun, who specialized in financial crimes. Chun explained they had been reviewing Elena's background and had discovered several concerning patterns. In the year before her disappearance, Elena had systematically liquidated assets. She had withdrawn funds from a personal savings account Michael had not known existed, closed a separate investment portfolio, and transferred money through a series of transactions designed to obscure the trail. The total amounted to nearly $80,000, accumulated over years through careful saving and undisclosed income sources. Chun also found that Elena had applied for credit cards using her maiden name, addresses Michael was unfamiliar with, and employment information that listed consulting work rather than her position at the research institute. These accounts were paid regularly but kept entirely separate from their shared finances. Additionally, records showed Elena had been corresponding with a family law attorney 6 months before she vanished. The attorney, when contacted by investigators, confirmed that Elena had scheduled consultations regarding divorce procedures but never followed through with filing. She had asked detailed questions about asset division, spousal support, and how to protect individual finances during separation. Brennan explained that while none of this proved criminal intent, it demonstrated premeditation. Elena had been planning her departure methodically. The question was why she chose to vanish rather than pursue legal separation, and whether her actions crossed into fraud or identity theft. Miami police confirmed that Elena Reeves had been residing at the documented address for 6 years. Utility records, lease agreements, and tax filings all used that name. She had obtained a Florida driver's license using a birth certificate that investigators were now working to verify. If the document was forged or fraudulently obtained, charges could be filed. Detectives also identified the man Michael had seen in the shopping complex. His name was Daniel Reeves, a software engineer originally from Orlando. Public records showed he and Elena had married 4 years earlier in a small civil ceremony. In Key West, the boy was their son, born 3 years ago at a Miami hospital. Michael absorbed this information in silence. Elena had not simply disappeared. She had constructed an entirely new identity, complete with legal documents, a marriage, and a child. She had been living a parallel life while he spent 9 years believing she might be dead. Brennan asked if Michael wanted to pursue charges. The decision was partly his, though the state could also prosecute independently if sufficient evidence of fraud existed. Michael requested time to consider. The detective agreed, noting that building a case would take weeks regardless. That evening, Michael sat in his apartment trying to reconcile the woman he had married with the person detectives described. Elena had always been methodical, but this level of planning suggested something beyond ordinary discontent. She had researched divorce, consulted attorneys, and then rejected legal channels entirely. Why? He thought about the months before she vanished, searching for signs he had missed. Her distraction, the late hours, the phone kept face down. All of it now made sense. She had been preparing, executing a plan that required secrecy and patience. But what had driven her to such extremes? What had their marriage lacked that made starting over seem preferable to simply leaving honestly? 3 weeks later, Brennan called again. Forensic accountants had traced Elena's financial movements more thoroughly. The $80,000 she withdrew had been supplemented by additional funds from a source investigators were still identifying. The money allowed her to relocate, establish residency, and support herself during the transition period before meeting Daniel Reeves. More significantly, the birth certificate used to obtain her Florida driver's license was confirmed as fraudulent. It belonged to a woman named Elena Reeves, who had died in infancy 37 years earlier in Pennsylvania. Elena Torres had purchased the identity through channels investigators were now tracing. a federal offense that carried substantial penalties. Brennan explained that with this evidence, prosecutors could file charges for identity fraud, falsification of government documents, and financial misconduct related to the concealment of marital assets. Miami police were coordinating with federal agencies, given the interstate nature of the offenses. The detective asked Michael again whether he wanted to proceed. This time, he said yes. Federal marshals coordinated with Miami police to execute the arrest on a Thursday morning. They chose the timing deliberately, waiting until Daniel Reeves had left for work and their son was at school. The goal was to minimize trauma and avoid unnecessary confrontation. Officers knocked on the door of Unit 412 at 8:15. Alina answered wearing casual clothes, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition when the lead marshal identified himself and stated the charges. According to the incident report, she did not resist or argue. She asked only if she could make a phone call. The request was denied until after processing. She was handcuffed, read her rights, and escorted to a waiting vehicle. Detective Brennan called Michael that afternoon to confirm the arrest. Alina was being held pending arraignment, where bail would be determined based on flight risk assessment. Given her history, prosecutors intended to argue for detention without bond. Brennan explained that Michael would likely be called to testify during proceedings, both at hearings and potentially at trial. Daniel Reeves learned of his wife's arrest when officers contacted him at his office. According to statements he later gave investigators, he had known Alina as someone who had escaped an abusive first marriage, a fabricated story she had maintained throughout their relationship. She told him her ex-husband had been controlling and violent, and that she had fled to protect herself. Daniel had never questioned the narrative. It explained her reluctance to discuss her past and her careful approach to personal information. When detectives informed him that Alina Torres was still legally married to Michael Torres, that her identity was fraudulent, and that her entire history was a construction, Daniel's response was described as stunned silence. He requested an attorney immediately and declined further comment. The arraignment occurred 3 days later. Michael did not attend, but Brennan provided him with updates. Alina appeared before a federal magistrate, represented by a public defender. Prosecutors presented evidence of identity fraud, falsified documents, and financial misconduct. They argued she had successfully evaded detection for 9 years and posed an extreme flight risk. The defense argued that Alina had built a stable life, had a young child who needed her, and had not committed violent crimes. They requested reasonable bail with electronic monitoring. The magistrate sided with prosecution. Bail was denied. Alina was remanded to federal custody pending trial. Michael received notification that he was required to provide a deposition. 2 weeks later, he sat across from prosecutors in a Miami federal building, answering questions about his marriage, Alina's disappearance, and the financial impact of her actions. He described finding her car, the note, the years of uncertainty. Prosecutors recorded everything, building a timeline that demonstrated premeditation and deliberate deception. He was asked if he had any explanation for why Alina had chosen this path. Michael said he did not. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Janet Voss, noted that in interviews Alina had declined to provide substantive answers. She admitted to the facts but offered no justification, stating only that it had seemed necessary at the time. Discovery materials revealed additional details. Investigators found records of Alina purchasing the false identity through an online broker specializing in stolen or recycled documentation. She had paid $12,000 for the package, which included the birth certificate, supporting documents, and instructions for establishing residency. They also traced her movements during the first 2 years after her disappearance. She had lived briefly in Atlanta, working cash jobs under different names, before settling in Miami. The transition from Alina Torres to Alina Reeves had been completed over 18 months, a gradual process of building credit history, employment records, and social connections that legitimized her new identity. Daniel Reeves filed for emergency custody of their son while Alina remained detained. Family court granted temporary custody, with Alina allowed supervised visitation pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Daniel also consulted a divorce attorney, beginning the process of dissolving a marriage that had been legally invalid from the start, since Alina's existing marriage to Michael had never been annulled or dissolved. Michael learned these details through updates from Brennan and documents provided by prosecutors. Each revelation deepened his understanding of how thoroughly Alina had erased her former life. She had not simply run away. She had systematically dismantled one existence and constructed another, eliminating connections to anyone who knew her as Elena Torres. Prosecutors offered Elena a plea agreement if she pleaded guilty to federal identity fraud charges. They would recommend a sentence of 8 years with eligibility for parole after 5. If she refused and proceeded to trial, they would pursue maximum penalties that could result in 15 years or more. Elena's attorney requested time to consider. 2 weeks later, the answer came back. Elena would plead guilty. She would accept responsibility for the fraud and face sentencing without contesting the facts. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend the minimum range and to allow her testimony, to focus on the mechanics of the fraud rather than her personal motivations. The plea hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Michael was notified he could attend if he wished. He spent days considering whether seeing Elena again would provide closure or simply reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. Ultimately, he decided he needed to be there, not for her, but for himself. To see the person who had destroyed his sense of reality finally face consequences for her choices. The federal courthouse in Miami was a stark building of concrete and glass, designed to project authority rather than comfort. Michael arrived early on the morning of the sentencing hearing, passing through security and finding a seat in the gallery. The courtroom was sparsely populated. A few reporters, Daniel Reeves sitting alone near the back, and several individuals Michael assumed were connected to the legal proceedings. Elena was brought in by a marshal, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked smaller than Michael remembered, her face showing the strain of months in detention. When she entered, her eyes scanned the room briefly. They landed on Michael, held for a moment, then moved away. No recognition, no acknowledgement, just a glance that conveyed nothing. Judge Richard Castellano presided, a man in his 60s whose reputation for measured sentencing was well documented. The proceeding began with the formal entry of Elena's guilty plea to federal charges of identity fraud and falsification of documents. Her attorney confirmed she understood the charges and accepted responsibility without contest. Prosecutor Janet Voss presented a sentencing memorandum outlining the scope of Elena's deception. 9 years of fraudulent identity use, a bigamous marriage, financial harm to her legal spouse, the construction of an elaborate false life that required continuous deceit. Voss argued that while Elena had not committed violent crimes, the calculated nature of her actions warranted a sentence that reflected the seriousness of sustained fraud. Elena's public defender, Thomas Garrett, offered mitigating arguments. His client had no prior criminal history. She had been a productive member of her community in Miami, employed steadily and raising a child. Garrett suggested psychological evaluation had revealed profound anxiety and unspecified personal trauma that contributed to her decision to flee her former life. He requested the court consider the minimum recommended sentence. Judge Castellano asked Elena if she wished to make a statement. She stood, her voice quiet but steady. "I understand what I did was wrong. I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I made choices that I can't defend, and I accept the consequences." She paused, glancing briefly toward where Michael sat. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to say I'm sorry for the pain I caused." The statement was brief and offered no explanation. Michael felt no satisfaction hearing it. The apology was empty, a procedural gesture required by the moment but lacking substance. Judge Castellano reviewed the case file, then addressed the court. He acknowledged the absence of violence but emphasized the deliberate, sustained nature of the fraud. Elena Torres had not made an impulsive mistake. She had executed a plan that spanned years and required ongoing deception toward multiple people, including a man she married under false pretenses and a child born into a fabricated reality. The judge sentenced Elena to 7 years in federal prison, with eligibility for supervised release after serving 5. He also ordered restitution payments to Michael for documented financial losses and legal expenses. The amount was modest but symbolic. Elena would carry the debt for years after her release. The hearing concluded within 90 minutes. Marshals escorted Elena out through a side door. She did not look back. Outside the courthouse, Michael stood on the steps, unsure what to do next. Daniel Reeves emerged shortly after, pausing when he saw Michael. The two men regarded each other for a long moment. Finally, Daniel approached. "I didn't know," Daniel said quietly. "Any of it?" Michael nodded. "I believe you. My son keeps asking when his mother is coming home. I don't know how to explain this to a 4-year-old. Daniel's voice carried exhaustion rather than anger. I'm sorry, Michael offered, unsure what else to say. Yeah, Daniel walked away without further comment. Michael returned to Wilmington the next day. He met with Detective Brennan one final time to review the case closure. All charges had been resolved. The investigation was officially complete. Brennan asked how he was managing. Michael gave an honest answer. He didn't know yet. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself gravitating toward routines that had sustained him during Alana's absence. Morning runs, work projects, weekend soccer games. But something had shifted. The uncertainty that had defined 9 years was gone, replaced by unwelcome clarity. Alana had not been lost. She had chosen to leave, methodically and completely. That knowledge was harder to carry than ambiguity had been. Michael kept the restitution checks when they arrived, small monthly payments deducted from Alana's prison wages. He deposited them without examining the amounts. The money mattered less than the acknowledgement they represented. He did not visit Alana in prison. He did not write letters or seek further explanation. Whatever had driven her decisions remained hers to carry. He had spent enough years trying to understand a person who had never been fully honest with him. One evening, nearly a year after the sentencing, Michael removed Alana's wedding ring from his nightstand drawer. He had kept it through everything, uncertain why. Now, he placed it in a small box with old photographs and legal documents, sealing it and storing it in a closet. Not discarded, but no longer visible. Life continued as it always does, shaped by what had happened but no longer defined by it. Michael remained in Wilmington, his work steady, his routines intact. He was not whole, but he was no longer waiting for answers that would never satisfy the questions. And in that acceptance, he found something resembling peace.